Good evening. I'm Ken Garrison, former pastor of Fellowship Church in Florida and the director of the Zamok Institute for Biblical Studies. We started a series last week looking at the biblical view or biblical pattern that we could call heaven and earth. Everybody, I guess, has in their mind some sense of what that means, but we want to develop as much as we can a clear biblical picture of heaven and earth. We suggested last week that there are two realms of existence. Earth, that we're obviously familiar with because our life has been experienced in space-time. When I say space-time, I mean length, width, and height, and time, and with mass. That would be the definition, really, of space-time, I think. But we want to suggest that there's a parallel universe that the Bible calls heaven, and this parallel universe is multidimensional. We don't know how many dimensions. We're beginning to speculate about that, but we don't know how many, what the dimensions actually are. So that remains to be seen. God hadn't revealed that to us yet. But we have a sense of that in the Bible, and that's what we want to look into today. Now, we also suggested last week that science has been, in its endeavor to understand the universe, has developed what's now known as string theory. I suggested in last week's program that you might, whatever your search engine you use on your computer, you might look up string theory, and there are very good explanations of what that might mean. Now, these are general explanations which you can easily understand. The mathematics of string theory you probably won't understand, but that you don't need to. At any rate, string theory has come up to believe that there perhaps is 7 additional dimensions that do not have mass. So that is, in my mind at least, points toward what we see as a biblical definition of heaven. So I suspect that research scientists are backing into the reality of the dimensions of what we want to call heaven. Now, you realize that years ago there was all kinds of issues about creation, how the creation came into being, and the biblical definition was very simple: God created. And science didn't accept that, obviously, but with more knowledge and more observations that scientists made, they eventually concluded that the creation came into being in the so-called Big Bang. Well, the Big Bang is what happened when God said, "Let there be." And so we believe, again, that's an indication where science has backed into agreement, basically, with biblical revelation. We're interested in biblical revelation, and so that's what we're going to be looking at today. Now, the Bible gives us many accounts of individuals that are movement from earth to heaven and from heaven to earth, back and forth. And so we want to look at a number of events today that describe what actually happened. And these are awesome events to consider. Now, I think most people, many people at least, read through the biblical account and they mentally dismiss the significance of what's being recorded. The people that actually experienced them was marked for the whole life as a result of what they had experienced and witnessed and saw. So it's a very real phenomenon, and we need to consider it and take it into account. Now, we're going to start tonight with the story of Jacob, the patriarch Jacob, he at Bethel. Now, God initiated the redemptive covenant with Abraham and Abraham's son Isaac and Abraham's grandson Jacob. Jacob was a bit of a character, and he was second born in his family. His older brother Esau. Now, they're only separated by minutes, but nevertheless, in the Oriental family, the firstborn would receive the clan authority, the double portion, and the blessing. Well, Jacob found his brother Esau in a weak moment, and he traded him out of the double blessing. Of the birthright. And then later he deceived his father into giving him the blessing. So Jacob lived up to his name and got what he wanted. Well, Esau, his brother, was irritated at that. Irritated wasn't quite the right word, probably. He vowed to kill Jacob as soon as his father Isaac had died. And even though Isaac lived many years after these events, nevertheless, that was what Esau intended to do. So Jacob fled. He went north. They were living in the south of modern Israel, in the vicinity of Beersheba. They were nomadic herdsmen, and so they were living in the south, and Jacob fled north. He was going to his uncle Laban's house in the upper reaches of the Euphrates River, which would be near the intersections of Syria, Turkey, and Iraq today. At any rate, Jacob fled. So we find him a little north of what is today Jerusalem, approximately 10 miles, at the site, biblical site called Luz, but it becomes Bethel, Beit El. And so we want to read from the Bible the account of what happened to Jacob at Beit El. Now, it was nighttime or late evening, and so he laid down to sleep. And so, I assume it was in the summertime, or at least warm, because that can be pretty cold in those areas in the wintertime. Anyway, he laid down to sleep, and I'll read. He had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on this ladder. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your descendants. So God is initiating the covenant, a renewal of the covenant that he had made with Abraham and later with Isaac. Now it's being reestablished with Jacob. Now, Jacob, I'm reading again Genesis 28, 16 and 17. Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid, and he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Now, in Hebrew, the word Beit means house. Beit El, the house, El of God, the house of God. But more important to our thesis here is the second name that he associated with this site. He called it the Sha'ar HaShamayim. Sha'ar is a word for gate or gateway to heaven, Hashemayim. So Jacob said, this is the gateway to heaven. Now, hopefully you can understand the significance of this declaration relative to the idea that we're setting forth tonight of individuals passing from heaven into earth and earth into heaven, because this is the gateway. Now, Bethel itself is mountainous country. It's very rough terrain, and Jacob sleeps there and awakens. Next day, he proceeds on his journey, goes north. He spends 20 years with his uncle Laban, and God speaks to him actually to return to Israel. So now he has actually 4 wives. 2 regular wives and 2 maids, and he has 11 sons and 1 daughter, and a host of herds of camels, donkeys, sheep, goats. He has become a very rich man with his time at Uncle Laban's house. So now when he returns to the land, after, I'm not sure of the time frame, months probably, he returns to this same site at Bethel, and the Lord speaks to him again and confirms the covenant to Jacob at Bethel, and now his name now has been changed by God to Israel. And it says that God speaks to him. Let me read from Genesis 35:13. After speaking to Jacob, it says, then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. So God ascended from earth, from space-time earth, into heaven, from this site, Bethel, again, just a little north of Jerusalem. So this is a specific example of God moving back and forth from heaven to earth. Now, we can read through that very, very simply, and perhaps it doesn't have a great impact on us, but I can assure you that these events had an incredible impact on Jacob. He had experienced the presence of the living God speaking to him, and then God ascending into heaven from that site. Now, the next account that we want to look at, and we're going to look at a number of these specific accounts given to us in the Bible, concerns Joshua. Now, in the days of Jacob, in the latter days of his life, his clan moved to Egypt. You know the story of Joseph. God had sent Joseph there to prepare for them to arrive in Egypt. I maintain that God used Egypt as an incubator for this infant nation Israel for 400 years, and by the end of that 400-year period, they are not just a clan, but they are a nation in the formation, and God is bringing them out and is going to bring them back into the land of Israel, the land of promise. They come to Mount Sinai. God makes his covenant with the nation now, not just the patriarchs or the individual, but the covenant now is with the nation of Israel. And so they spend 40 years in the wilderness because of disobedience, and eventually Moses dies, and leadership is transferred to Joshua. And so they cross the Jordan River. Miraculously, the Lord separates the river. They walk through. Now, this is in flood season. This is March, April time, and it would be a flood season in that area at that time. And so the river was swollen. It was separated. They walked through, and they are ready to come into the land and possess it. They have to fight for every inch of it. And so their first problem is the city of Jericho. Jericho was an ancient city near the Jordan River on the plains of Jericho, and it's a wall city, and there are an army inside the walls of the city, chariots, horses and chariots, and their army. And so Joshua is concerned about how he's going to deal with it, because if his army leaves his base camp there and goes up into the highlands and starts occupying the land, then the families, the camp is going to be vulnerable to whatever army is in Jericho. So he has to deal with it. So it's written in Joshua 5:13, it came about when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked. He was making a surveillance of the city. And behold, a man was standing opposite him with a sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said, are you for us or for our adversaries? Now, it's obvious from this question that Joshua sees this individual as an ordinary human. However, the answer that he gets from his question, I'll read it, Joshua 5:14 and 15. He said, no, rather I come as the captain of the host of the Lord. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, what has my Lord to say to his servant? The captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Now, the only other place that I'm aware of where such an incident happened was Moses, when God met Moses at the so-called burning bush at Mount Sinai, and was commanded to remove his sandals. The place where he was standing is holy. Now, this individual that Joshua meets is the captain of the hosts of the Lord. This is not an ordinary human being. I don't even think it's an angel. It could possibly be considered such, but I think it is, we might call it a pre-incarnate manifestation of Messiah Jesus. Now, one of the things that we won't touch tonight in this study, but one of the things that is real is God has the capacity to walk about in time. And Jesus, at least after his resurrection, has similar traits. So we believe that this is actually Jesus, the captain of the hosts of the Lord. Now, that's debatable, and so I don't want you to get hung up on that one way or the other. It doesn't matter. Joshua was amazed at what he had encountered, and he was given the instructions concerning how to take Jericho. And you know the story of marching around Jericho, the walls falling, and them taking Jericho. So an awesome experience by Joshua. Now we want to go to our third example, and that has to do with the individual that we know as Samson, Shimshon in Hebrew, and his parents. Now, before Samson was conceived, his mother, they lived in the area of Dan, perhaps not far from modern-day Tel Aviv, perhaps near what would be Ben Gurion Airport. Today, if you happen to fly into Israel, you'll land at Ben Gurion. So I think they were probably living roughly near that area in the land at that time. Now, the mother of Samson, the mother-to-be of Samson, was out in the countryside. I don't know what she was doing, berry picking, I don't know. And she met an individual. She met a man, and he started speaking about that she was going to have a son. And so she went and got her husband. Her husband's name is Manoah. And they both come, and the angel and this individual, now they don't know it's an angel, again, appears as an ordinary human being, and they speak of that they are going to conceive and bring forth this special son, Samson, who would become one of the judges of Israel in that era. Now, we're talking about perhaps 1,200 years before the time of Jesus. Typical for Oriental family, they wanted to prepare a meal and have a meal with this individual, have table fellowship, in other words. And so they suggest that, and I'm reading Judges 13:16. The angel of the Lord said to Manoah, "Though you detain me, I will not eat your food, but if you prepare a burnt offering and offer it to the Lord." Then Manoah did not know that he was an angel of the Lord. Still, they don't know. So they put some stones together to build an altar and start a fire. And it doesn't say anything about making a specific sacrifice. I don't think they got to that point. When the fire was raging, we read Judges 13:20, it came about when the flame went up from the altar toward heaven that the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame of the altar, and Manoah and his wife saw this, they fell on their faces to the ground. Now, so this individual that they had been speaking with all of a sudden steps into the flame and ascends into heaven. So all of a sudden they realize that this is not your normal human that they have been conversing with. This has been a messenger. The word angel actually means messenger. This has been a messenger from God. A messenger who had descended from heaven onto earth, had conversed with them, interacted with them, and now in the flames of that altar had ascended back into heaven. So again, let me make the point that heaven, we believe, biblically speaking, heaven is a very real space with very real entities, we might say individuals, living or occupying heaven. Now, we don't know a great deal about it, but the Bible gives us some sense of that. Now, our next event that we're going to look at is the prophet Elijah, Eliyahu or Elijah. Elijah was one of the boldest prophets that we have in the Hebrew Scriptures. And Elijah had confronted Ahab and Jezebel. They were the leaders of the northern kingdom of Israel in those days. Israel was divided, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And Ahab and Jezebel ruled over the northern kingdom of Israel. I call them the Clintons of their day. Jezebel was uniquely evil, and she, in fact, as a result of a conflict with Elijah, she vowed to kill him. Now, we like to think of Elijah as some super bold prophet, but his feet wouldn't hold him, and he ran for it. He ran for his life, and we find him running all the way south, perhaps something like 200 miles, to the site that we know as Mount Sinai. And the Lord says something to the mighty prophet there that is interesting. He said, Elijah, he said, here I am. He said, what are you doing here? Now, if you're a mighty prophet of God, you don't want him asking you, what are you doing here? So anyway, because of these events, God evidently planned to replace Elijah with his helper, Elisha. And so the next thing that we want to talk about is, I got ahead of myself. Elijah and Elisha. Now, Elisha now is the individual that God had chosen to replace Elijah. And they're walking along, they've crossed the Jordan River, and they're in what would be modern-day Jordan. And let me read what happened. As recorded, 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 11. As they were going along and talking, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, separated the two of them, Elijah and Elisha, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind to heaven. Now, a whirlwind, it means an awesome storm, a cloud, storm, lightning, whatever. But this conveyance, this horse and chariot of fire, was a conveyance of Elijah into heaven. And as far as we know, this is the only event recorded where a live individual ascended directly into heaven. And so this is an awesome account. Later on, we're going to find Moses and Elijah speaking to Jesus. So he made it fine, however he got there. So again, we find an account of an individual being transported from earth directly into heaven by way of a conveyance of a chariot of chariots and horse of fire. Whatever that may mean, I don't know. Now, Elisha goes from there, and we find him next at a site called Dothan, which would be a little bit north of the present city of Shechem in Israel, in north central Israel, I guess we would consider it. We're talking about, 40 miles north of Jerusalem, something like that. Israel is a very small state. Now, Elisha and his servant has spent the night there, and they had some sort of house. I'm not sure. Maybe they were guests at somebody's house. That happened from time to time. We don't know. Anyway, they slept overnight, and I want to read what happened from 2 Kings 6. Now, when the attendant of the man of God had risen early and gone out, behold, an army with horses and chariots were circling the city. Now, at this time in history, the northern kingdom of Israel was in open warfare with the kingdom of Syria located in Damascus. And this warfare went back and forth between Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel many times. And so now this servant awakes, goes outside in the morning, and suddenly he sees himself surrounded by an array of Syrian soldiers, horses and chariots. And so he says, alas, my master, what shall we do? He's scared. So Elisha answered and said, do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And so Elisha sees something that his servant does not see. So Elisha prayed, I'm reading in 2 Kings 6:17. Elisha prayed and said, O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. So now, in the past, we have worked closely with the settlement of Kedemim in the same area, and it's very mountainous. So these mountains all around Dothan, all around Shechem, all around Kedemim, these mountains were filled with horses of chariots and horses of fire. That would be the army of the Lord that Elisha and his servant had encountered. Now, these evidently have to be an angelic being, some sort of angelic agency that God has sent onto the mountains of Israel to actually, in this case, to protect Elisha and his servant. Now, I want to suggest to you that these same mountains will be the site of what the Bible terms as the Battle of Armageddon or Har-Megiddo. Armageddon is just it's an English translation of a Greek translation of Har-Megiddo. And this is where this climactic battle is prophesied to be. And I believe that when the nations get bold enough to come up and confront Israel with their huge array of armies, that these army of the Lord's host, this array of horses and fire, of horses and chariots of fire on the mountains of Israel, is going to be the thing that the armies of the nations will meet, and that will signal, I believe, the coming of the Lord. All right, let's go on. I want we're actually going into the New Testament era, and we're going to be talking about Jesus and some events that happened in his life. Jesus had taken Peter, James, and John, which he often did things privately with them that was not done with the rest of the disciples, so they were sort of an inner core group. He takes them up on the mountain, evidently like a retreat to pray. And I believe that they're on Mount Hermon in the north. Some people believe that they're on Mount Tabor. It doesn't really matter what the mountain is, but they are there and they're praying. And I want to read from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, verses 29 and 31, and says, while he was praying, the appearance of his face, speaking of Jesus, became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming, and behold, two men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah. Now remember, just a few moments ago, we talked about Elijah being taken into heaven, and his life was still going. He swept up into heaven. Now he appears with Moses and Elijah, and they were appearing in glory and were speaking of his departure, which was he about to accomplish in Jerusalem. When he talks about his departure, it means that crucifixion on the cross in Jerusalem. So Moses and Elijah appears to Jesus. Now, it's important to know that Jesus glowed. Now, there are two ways to look at this. We could say that Jesus actually ascended into heaven and met Moses and Elijah there, and he glowed. That's what he saw. Or else Moses and Elijah descended from heaven onto earth, and they're speaking to Jesus and caused his glow. We don't know which way it is. and we probably won't know that for some time. At any rate, it is another indication of this type of transition that took place. Now, the Bible says, Luke 9:34 and 35, while he was saying this, a cloud formed and began to overshadow them, and they were afraid, and they entered the cloud. Now, in all of these occasions, I can assure you that the human participants in these things were afraid. Things were happening to them that were absolutely awesome beyond their comprehension. Anyway, a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." So that's the Father, the awesome one, the God of Israel, speaking concerning Jesus. And so they were amazed. Now, in this particular account, we have a specific record of how this impacted Peter. We have an account, 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. Peter is recounting this event, 30, 40 years later. And it obviously is still burning in his soul what he experienced on that day. And so he writes, "For when he," meaning Jesus, "received honor and glory from God the Father, such an utterance as this was made to him by the majestic glory." He speaks of God the Father as the majestic glory. "This is my beloved Son with whom I'm well pleased." And we ourselves heard this utterance made from heaven, and when we were with him, Jesus, on the holy mountain. So this impacted Peter in an awesome way, so that 30, 40 years later, he's still dwelling in it. And I will suggest to you that every time that Peter went aside privately in devotion for a personal prayer life, that he recounted this specific event because it was burned in his soul. All right, next we want to go to Jesus after the resurrection to look at his ascension, because he, again, in the resurrection body, ascended from earth into heaven. Jesus had assembled the disciples. Later they would be called sent ones, apostles, and spoke to them of what was going to be happening to them next. This is recorded in the book of Acts, chapter 1. And it says that after he had spoken to them, after he had said these things, he, Jesus, was lifted up while they were looking on, and a cloud received him out of their sight. So Jesus ascended into heaven from earth. Now, the next scripture we want to look at is what happened immediately following that. I'll read Acts 1, 10 and 11. And they were standing there intently gazing at the sky while he was going. Behold, 2 men in white clothing stood beside them. Now, there were, I guess, 11 of them standing there with Jesus. He ascends, and suddenly there's 13 men standing there. And they had very white clothing. I suspect they were glowing. Anyway, they said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into the sky? This Jesus, who has been taken up from you into heaven," now it's explicit declaration, "into heaven, will come in just the same way as you have watched him go into heaven." Hence the promise of Jesus' return. Now, I want to wrap up today with one final event. And we're going to backtrack all the way back to the time of Moses and at Mount Sinai. Now, the event that we're talking about is, to date, the most profound intervention from heaven to earth that we have recorded in the Bible. Now, we believe that it foreshadows an intervention that's getting ready to take place when Jesus descends in the future with a host into earth, and he says he's coming in the glory of his Father. And so I believe that what we see at Mount Sinai, we're going to see when Jesus descends onto the Mount of Olives, just like the angelic beings is spoken of before. By the way, those angelic beings that spoke to the disciples there didn't stay there. They evidently ascended back into heaven. They're waiting to come again. So in Exodus chapter 19, Israel has been delivered out of Egypt by under the hand of Moses. They trek through the wilderness, and they come to the mountain where Moses had met God at the burning bush. And so God speaks to him there. The Lord said to Moses, I'm at Exodus 19:9, behold, I will come to you in a thick cloud, so that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe in you forever. By the way, there's no prophet that's more honored in Jewish thought than Moses. And so what God spoke here certainly was fulfilled. And so all the people were gathered at the base of the mountain. And so I want to read what happened then at that time. Came about on the third day, when it was morning, that there were thunder and lightning and flashes and thick cloud upon the mountain, and a very loud trumpet sound. And so all the people who were in the camp trembled. Again, they were terrified. They thought that they were going to die with what they were seeing. And by the way, you and I wouldn't think anything differently if we had been there and experienced the same thing. So Exodus 19:18, Mount Sinai was all in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently. So I think every sense that the Israelis had at this juncture was totally saturated. Hearing, smelling, perhaps tasting, feeling, hearing, seeing. All their senses were pegged, as we used to say concerning making electrical measurements on a meter. The instrument was pegged, over, meaning all the way over. That's what happened to all their senses. And so the Lord came down, the Bible says, on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain. Now later, you know the story that Moses ascended to the top of the mountain, and he was, I think, actually transferred into heaven. Now, the Bible doesn't expressly tell us that, so I didn't use that as an example, but I believe what happened to Moses when he ascended for 40 days and 40 nights without drinking or eating, that he actually stepped over into the heavenly realm when he was there. When he returned, he glowed, and he glowed for a long time. They had to put a veil on him because people were afraid of him. So now, later on, the last account that Moses gives us, recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, I want to read from chapter 4, verse 11. So Moses recounts the experience of that day. Now, this is 40 years later. Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, Mount Sinai, when the Lord said to me, assemble the people to me, that I may let them hear my word, so that they may learn to fear me and all the days they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children. So you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire. Now here's the part I want you to hear. It burned with fire to the very heart of heaven, darkness, cloud, and thick gloom. So this incident was such that there had been a coupling between heaven and earth so powerful that they were experiencing things, in Moses' word, to the very heart of heaven. Now, the Bible, prophetically, the Bible talks about a new heaven and a new earth. And that new heaven and new earth simply means that, John saw it in the book of Revelation, the new heaven is coming down into the new earth and is coupled by the city New Jerusalem. We suspect that New Jerusalem serves the same function as the garden did in the early Genesis account. Now, in any case, we have cited to you numerous examples of individuals going from their space-time, walking around in Earth existence just like we are today, and suddenly, or by whatever means, ascending into the heavens. We have seen examples where angelic beings descended, spoke to people, ascended again. So there has been and continues to be transport back and forth from earth to heaven. So again, we maintain that heaven is a very real multidimensional realm, perhaps of 7 dimensions, without mass, and there are real inhabitants of this realm that we call heaven. Actually, the Holy One is there. Jesus is there now at this particular point in time, and hopefully, I suspect Peter, James, and John are probably there. Moses and Elijah, we already had an idea. Jesus said something about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob being there. And perhaps you've had dear friends, parents perhaps, siblings, friends, neighbors that you knew walked in a godly life that died and we believe went to heaven. They're there too. All of them are getting ready to come back to earth because God is establishing His kingdom on planet Earth. Now, that's our account for our day, for our next week and our next study. We're going to look at this area that we've been talking about where all of these transitions took place. We're going to be looking at the international global effort to control this area, which is as old as the Bible. And it is going on as we speak. There will never be peace in the Middle East. There will never be peace in Israel until it is established by God. We believe that God is going to send a king, even Messiah Jesus, to reign, the Bible says, with a rule of iron, and then there will be peace. Until next week, shalom.